Hello, class. Today's lesson is going to be about two types of microorganisms. The first are called protists, and they are very, very interesting. And then we have fungi. So we are going to begin with protists. Um, a protist is made up of one or more eukaryotic cells. So protists I will say are usually unicellular, meaning the whole organism is only one cell big. Sometimes, in the case of what we're going to learn about now, algae, they can be a few cells big. But most protists are only one cell big, and the type of cell that protists are made up of is the eukaryotic cell, the one with things like um, the nucleus and other membrane-bound organelles like the mitochondria and the endoplasmic reticulum and the Golgi body. Protists vary a great deal in what they look like. And I'm going to show you some today. I'm going to show you some protists that are moving, and you won't believe just the variety of creatures that fall into this group. So they have different sizes. Some are very big. Um, some algae are like a foot long. They vary in their shape. We're going to see a lot of different types of shapes today. How they obtain food and how they move. So while you're looking at these organisms today and while you're doing your homework, pay special attention to how they obtain food and how they move and how they maintain homeostasis in um, the the watery environment that they live in. Scientists often group protists based on how similar they are to organisms of other eukaryotic kingdoms. So we have plant-like protists who can do photosynthesis and are like plants in that way. But the difference is protists are usually one-celled and plants are many-celled. They're multicellular. There are also animal-like protists. Animal-like protists have to eat other things in order to survive. They can't do photosynthesis. And there are even fungi-like protists that have sort of a cell wall similar to other fungi. But we don't know about fungi yet. So we're going to talk about plant-like protists and animal-like protists. An example of a plant-like protist is algae. Algae are plant-like protists that live in aquatic environments, aquatic, of course, meaning water environments, such as ocean, lakes, ponds, and even small puddles. Figure 6.8 shows the features of a typical algal cell. Notice the similarities with plant cells. So this is what an algae looks like over to the right side of the screen. This picture here is an alga. Alga is one, algae is plural. So we have a nucleus, right? That's how we can tell it's a eukaryotic cell. We have that big dark dot in the middle of the cell. And you'll notice that the nucleus is surrounded by a lot of green. Okay, that big green thing is a chloroplast or a region of chloroplasts. There is also a cell wall, like a plant. There are some starch vacuoles where the algae stores the food it makes in photosynthesis. There's a cell membrane, like all cells. You can see a mitochondria, right? So, like plants, algae also have mitochondria. And the reason is because they can't use the sugar they produce through photosynthesis. They have to convert it into ATP. So every single cell that needs energy from glucose, has to have mitochondria in order to break that sugar down and convert it to ATP. What else do they have? There's ribosomes for converting their genes into proteins. It has some flagella for movement, and they do move. Um, some cytoplasm or cytosol that all of the organelles float around with, and you can see a Golgi body. Okay, so this is the algae. Um, a lot like a plant cell, except a plant cell doesn't have flagella because it doesn't move. So, um, so for example, algal cells have cell walls. Algal cells also have chloroplasts that contain chlorophyll to carry out photosynthesis. Just as plants are the key producers in food chains on land, algae are the key producers of food chains in aquatic environments. So algae, I think, provide us with something like 70% of the breathable oxygen we have on Earth, even more than trees. And that's because there's a lot of them in oceans, right? Our Earth is covered in 70% water. So it makes sense then that all of this algae that is floating on the surface is working hard to do photosynthesis for us. I don't know why this word wrapped to the other line. There we go. Okay. Um, we have some examples of algae so you can see their shape. Let's see if I can zoom in on that. Not really letting me. There we go. So if you look at sand underneath the microscope, you will see a lot of these shapes, especially diatoms. Um, let's kind of take a look at that actually. So if you look at sand under a microscope, you'll see a lot of these weird little shapes. And these shapes are the what's left over. Um, so some of them are little shells, but a lot of them is what's left over from protists. If you'll see some of these shapes, and you'll see some of the shapes repeated when we look at these diatoms, right? Very beautiful. Um, so diatoms are protist algae that contain silica in their cell walls. And silica is the main chemical compound in glass, but also the main chemical compound in sand. So what happens is these diatoms, they live their lives and they die. And what remains of them is the glass, the sand. And because they're very, very small, right? Um, they just look like, you know, grains of like little rock chips. But in fact, when you pick up a handful of sand, you're probably picking up, hundreds of these little diatoms. They're little skeletons, they're little fossils that they left over. Really, really neat. We also have dinoflagellates. Dinoflagellates have flagella. They have three flagella, and they're at right angles to each other, which has them able to maneuver uh, very well in the water. Uh, Dinoflagellates we don't like to see in the water though because they are toxic and they build up in the tissues of the shellfish that eat them. And people who are exposed to those shellfish can become sick from the toxins. So, if you are a water quality specialist, you can work out in lakes and oceans where people fish, and you can test the water quality, or you can test the water quality on a fish farm, like a shellfish farm, and you can make sure that there are no dinoflagellates so that people don't get sick from they're toxins. They're euglenoids. Euglenoids have are funny little things. You're going to read about them later. They have some plant-like features and some animal-like features. So they have chloroplasts and they can do photosynthesis, but in low lighting conditions, they can switch and become animal-like and can eat other organisms. So euglenoids, um, they can they can do both, right? Not a lot of beings out there that can do both. I want to show you like very, very quickly how they move. So I have a euglenoid here, and euglenoids have a flagella, and you can see it'll kind of change its body shape, but you can see it has two flagella at the end there, and they're whipping around in sort of a circular motion like a propeller, and they're propelling the euglena through the water, and it's changing its cytoplasm. It's sort of reaching out with its cytoplasm in order to go even further. Kind of neat. And finally, we have green algae. Green algae has a lot of different forms. They don't all look like this. It's small, it's single-celled, and of course, a big part of our ocean food chain, um, converting sunlight into energy and then eaten by a lot of very small organisms. So we've talked about what they look like, and we've talked a little bit about how they propel themselves. Let's talk about reproduction. Most algae reproduce asexually by mitosis, right? Which means that they produce genetically identical offspring. Okay. Two identical daughter cells are produced from the division of a parent cell. Identical cells have the same DNA and the same DNA as the parent cell. Some microscopic algae can also produce sexually, and they do so when environmental conditions are unfavorable. So when they start being incompatible with their environment, they want to make a lot of babies that have different genes in them, and they hope that some of those offspring will be able to survive the conditions that the new conditions that are not favorable, meaning the algae are having a hard time adapting to their environment. So it says, for example, sexual reproduction can by chlamydomonas is shown in figure 6.9. It's complicated, and don't worry, you won't have to memorize this diagram. So this is an algae. For part of its life, it's haploid, and for part of its life, it's diploid. The difference is it's diploid during its zygote stage, and then the zygote divides by meiosis and gives haploid cells. So the adult algae, it actually spends its life in a haploid situation and only goes into a diploid situation if it has to reproduce sexually. Okay, so a little bit complicated, but you don't have to memorize this diagram. You just have to know that um, algae can reproduce sexually as well as reproducing asexually. That's it. Okay, so here are the steps. The chlamydomus cells are normally haploid, and under favorable conditions, they reproduce by mitosis, right? So that's step one in this diagram. If I can go back up. What about zooming in? There we go. Okay, so they're normally haploid. And then number two, so number two shows unfavorable conditions, and that stimulates cells to develop gametes. So you can see they develop gametes internally. Gametes of different mating types are released. They fuse together and they form a diploid organism. So that diploid organism is the zygote. And then when things are favorable again, the zygote divides by meiosis to produce normal haploid cells. Kind of weird, but that's how they do it. Now we're going to take a look at animal-like protists. So there are plant-like protists and animal-like protists. The animal-like protists are called protozoa. Um, and they cannot produce their own food. They don't have any chloroplasts. They have to consume other organisms for energy. Also, like animal cells, protozoa do not have cell walls or chloroplasts. The cell structure for a common ciliate protozoan is shown in figure 6.10. In addition to being covered in cilia, another feature of ciliates is that they have two nuclei. The micronucleus is used in reproduction, and all other cell functions are controlled by the macronucleus. So here we have something called a paramecium. And I'll show you what that looks like in real life under a microscope in a minute. So this has some features that are a little bit different. So it has hairs, right? Not just one or two long hairs. It has a bunch of short hairs. Those are called cilia. I think no, we learned about pili. So cilia are interesting. They beat in sort of a wave-like motion. And if you can see the um, at the top of the paramecium, there's like a little hole that's called the oral groove. And what happens is that food comes along, and the cilia hairs grab onto it, and they pass the food down, and it goes into the oral groove. Oral, right, is a word that means mouth. So this is the mouth on top of the paramecium, and it ingests by the food by endocytosis, and it ends up in a little vacuole where it's digested. Okay, you can see it has two nucleuses, a big one. That one does the normal cell functions, and a little one that sort of controls when it reproduces. Okay, it also has some water vacuoles. It's got a cell membrane and an outer layer that is not a cell wall, but is a little bit tougher, called a pellicle. Let's see what this looks like. You want to see how it moves? Probably not, but I'm going to show you anyway. Here we have some paramecia, and the cilia looks like a halo. And you can see it. There's like a little baby paramecium that got caught up in it, right? As they touch that outer halo, they kind of get dragged along by the little cilia fibers. Um, and that big paramecium could eat any one of those little paramecia. You'll also see like a sun-like shape right here in the big one. That's called a contractile vacuole, and that pumps water in and out of the paramecium um, so that it doesn't explode due to being in a hypotonic environment, right? So water will rush into the cell because there's more stuff inside the paramecium than outside in the water. And in order to maintain homeostasis and not explode, those little sun-shaped contractile vacuoles, they pump the water back out. Kind of neat. And you can see the cilia sort of um, pushing the paramecium through the water, and you can see it sort of rotates. Right here, that's an oral groove. Oh, here's a close-up of the contractile vacuole. See, it opens and closes and pushes water out. Kind of neat. I think that is just about all we have to show you there. We don't have a picture of one eating. No, just the contractile vacuole. Okay. So that's paramecium, and it's an animal like protist. Kind of neat. So, scientists group protozoa into four different types based on their environment. These four types are described in Table 6.5. So we have a ciliate like the paramecium. Ciliates move using short thread-like cilia that extend from the plasma membrane. The cilia can beat in an organized way that allows them to move, like oars in a boat. The cilium help them. Uh, the cilia also help them feed by swooping food into their bodies, into their oral groove, their mouth. There are rhizopods. An amoeba is an example of a rhizopod. Rhizopods move using foot-like structures called pseudopods. So pseudo means like, and pods means feet. So they have things like feet, so we call them pseudopods. The cytoplasm of the pseudopod is extended, and this flowing action allows them to move. Pseudopods also help in the capture of food by surrounding it and trapping it. And then again, they do the endocytosis thing. So let's take a look just for a second at um, the amoeba. This is a rhizopod. Kind of neat to watch them move. They move very slowly, but you can see that the cytoplasm is rushing sort of to the front. This is bringing lots of different things with it. And then the pseudopods, right? So these little feet are extending and they're allowing the amoeba to move, right? Not a fast process. Parameciums move so fast, sometimes you have to make the water thicker so they don't move as fast. Amoebas, you don't have that problem. They're just very chill organisms. And then we have flagellate. So some of the animal like protists, they move like the euglena. They have that whip at the back that rotates and acts like a motor on a boat. And then you have some that don't move at all. So these are sporozoans. No cilia, no flagella, no pseudopods. They just they live their life like they're on a lazy river. So they infect humans and other organisms, and they just move in the currents of their blood. And we don't like them there. Sporozoans are parasites, and they feed on other organisms, and they can cause illness. So you have a little reading on protists. Um, this there is no protist assignment. Oh no, sorry. We have one more. We have one more page to get through. How do protists reproduce? Sorry, how do protozoans reproduce? Protozoas reproduce by asexual reproduction. Like algae, most protozoa do this by binary fission or mitosis. Some protozoa can also reproduce by sexual reproduction. This involves two protozoans fusing together, and there are different ways that the fusion happens. In the case of sexual reproduction, genetic information is combined um, from the two parent organisms to produce offspring that have a different genetic makeup than the parents. Figure 6.11 shows how sexual reproduction occurs in paramecia. In this case, the fusion between cells is temporary and conjugation occurs, right? That's the sharing of genetic information. Two cells attach to each other at their surfaces and DNA is exchanged between cells. So you can see they're fusing. And what happens here is the micronucleus, the smaller of the two nucleuses, reproduce. So you can see, right, the reproduction in there. And then it says in each cell, the micronucleus undergoes meiosis, producing four haploid products, but three disintegrate, right? In each of the remaining haploid micronucleus undergoes, sorry, the micronucleus undergoes reproduction in mitosis. Then the two cells exchange a haploid micronucleus, and each cell's micronucleus and macronucleus disintegrates, and then the pair cells separate, and the genetically different micronuclei fuse to form a diploid nucleus. So crazy, right? So the micronuclei, they're going to come together and they're going to make a new macro um, to form a new nucleus that is genetically different. And the diploid nucleus undergoes 3 rounds of mitosis, producing 4 macronuclei and 4 micronuclei, which are distributed to the daughter cells. Um, this shows only one of the two cells. And then the cell with 8 nuclei undergoes 2 rounds of cytokinesis to produce 4 mature cells. That's bonkers. Don't worry. Again, you won't have to memorize any of this. Just know that they can reproduce sexually and asexually. Okay, here's where the homework comes in. So you're gonna have some worksheets to where you're gonna do a little bit of reading about protists, right? Because you're probably tired of hearing my voice. Um, and all of the important words are bolded for you. Okay. So you're gonna read about this. This is very much like what we went through in our lesson, and then there's some multiple choice questions about protests, and then you can see if you can answer them. I'll throw the homework questions up on uh, the answers up on the LMS. And then you have another reading that you can do that compares an amoeba, a paramecia, and a euglena. Um, and you can see the 3 cells. What they look like is very different. Okay, and you can in these diagrams look at what the organelles do in each of them, which is neat. And then there's a little chart comparing their similarities and differences. And then you have some questions to answer to test your understanding, right? So nothing to hand in, just doing the homework and familiarizing yourself with protists because you do have a test and you do have an exam. And usually I have a question at least on how the protists move. So that would be something very important to put on your study sheet. Okay. The next half of the lesson is on fungi, but I'm going to make another video for that.